And when my sister's fiance's father stood up from his chair, face completely white, and said, "I'm sorry. Are you the one who built the Aurora Ridge Pavilion?" The entire dining room went so quiet I could hear the ice shifting in someone's water glass. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to the beginning, because you need to understand what kind of family I come from before any of this makes sense. I grew up in Guelph, Ontario, in a house that smelled like mahogany furniture polish and ambition. My father is a senior partner at a Bay Street law firm. My mother spent 22 years as a Crown prosecutor before moving into private practice. Between the two of them, they've probably logged more billable hours than most people spend sleeping. That was the world I was raised in, one where your worth was directly proportional to your professional title, your postal code, and how impressive you sounded at dinner parties. My older sister Vanessa did everything right. U of T for undergrad, Osgood for law school, articled at a firm in Toronto's financial district. She met her fiancé, Marcus, at a charity gala in the Distillery District. His father is the kind of man whose name appears on hospital wings. They were, in my parents' eyes, the perfect match. And then there was me. I'm a registered nurse. I work in a cardiac step-down unit at a hospital here in Guelph, on rotating 12-hour shifts, often through the night. I've held the hands of people taking their last breaths. I've called codes. I've sat with families in waiting rooms at 2 in the morning and told them things no family wants to hear. I don't do it for the prestige. I do it because it matters in a way I can feel in my body at the end of every shift, exhausted and sure. My boyfriend Owen is a carpenter and builder. Not a contractor who manages projects from an office. He's someone who actually builds things with his hands. He has a workshop on a property outside Fergus, about 40 minutes from Guelph, where he designs and builds custom architectural woodwork. Staircases, cabinetry, pavilion structures, interior installations for high-end renovations. He studied fine arts and then apprenticed under a master craftsman in Quebec for 3 years. He's quiet about what he does. On our second date, when I asked him what his most ambitious project was, he just smiled and said, "A few things I'm proud of," and changed the subject. I thought he was being modest. I didn't know the half of it. My parents never warmed to Owen. That's putting it gently. The first time I brought him home for dinner, this was about 8 months into us dating, my father spent the entire meal asking pointed questions about Owen's business model and whether carpentry had stable growth potential. My mother asked, twice, whether he'd ever considered going back to school. Owen was gracious the entire evening, patient in a way I found almost supernatural. On the drive home, I apologized. He just reached over and squeezed my hand and said, "You don't have to apologize for them." I loved him more for that than I could explain. Things got worse once Vanessa got engaged. The engagement became a kind of extended performance in which my parents reminded everyone, loudly, constantly, at every family gathering, that their older daughter had done everything correctly. The subtext was always there. The comparison was always implied. Vanessa sensed it and felt guilty. She'd pull me aside at family dinners and say, "I'm sorry they're being like this." I always told her it was fine. It mostly was until it really wasn't. The housewarming happened in April. Vanessa and Marcus had just bought a place in Westmount, Quebec, a beautiful old stone house that they'd been renovating since December. The party was their first big gathering in the finished space. 60 guests, catered. Marcus's parents, Gerald and Elaine, flew in from Vancouver. My parents drove up from Guelph. Owen and I drove up separately. We'd planned to stay 2 nights in a hotel nearby. I remember standing in their kitchen the morning of, helping Vanessa arrange a charcuterie board, feeling genuinely happy for her. The house was beautiful. The renovation had turned out incredible: wide plank oak floors, custom built-ins, an open staircase with hand-forged iron railings. Vanessa was glowing. Marcus kept touching the small of her back as he moved through the kitchen. I thought, this is going to be a lovely evening. I should have known better. It started about an hour into the party. The guests were spread across the main floor and the garden, drinks in hand, the kind of comfortable hum of conversation you get when everyone knows someone. Owen was standing near the kitchen island, talking to Marcus's younger brother, the two of them laughing about something. He looked relaxed and completely himself. He always does. That's one of the things about him. My father appeared at my elbow. "You two seem comfortable," he said, and his tone already had that edge to it. "The one I've known my whole life. The one that says I'm making an observation, but we both know it's a verdict." "We are," I said. He looked across the room toward Owen. Your sister tells me he's still doing the carpentry thing. He builds architectural installations, Dad. Custom work. It's not the same as, I know what carpentry is, Jade." "That's my name, Jade. My mother named me after a stone she bought at a craft fair before I was born and then decided was bad luck. That's a separate story." My father swirled his wine. "I just wonder sometimes what the long-term plan looks like. For you, you're 31. You're a nurse, that's a noble thing, genuinely. But between the two of you, we're fine. Your mother and I just worry. You don't need to." He nodded slowly, the way he does when he's deciding to drop something, but also making sure you know he's choosing to drop it. Then he raised his voice, just slightly, just enough that the three people nearest us could hear, and said, "Well, at least one of our daughters is set up properly." He smiled in Vanessa's direction, and two of the people nearby laughed politely, and I felt my face go very still. Owen hadn't heard it. He was still talking to Marcus's brother, laughing again, and I was grateful for that. I took a sip of my sparkling water and said nothing. The dinner happened in 2 stages, a buffet first, then a seated portion at long tables in the garden under string lights. I found myself seated at the far end of a table from my parents, which I considered a small mercy. Owen was beside me, his knee touching mine under the table. Gerald, Marcus's father, was seated across from us, and next to him was a woman named Constance, who ran an architecture firm out of Montreal. They were in conversation with 2 other guests about a new mixed-use development in Old Quebec City. Owen was quiet, the way he usually is in groups he doesn't know. He listened more than he spoke. He asked Gerald a question about the property's original structure. The house dated to 1902, and Gerald answered enthusiastically, clearly pleased someone was interested. I could see my mother watching from 2 seats down, and I could tell she was categorizing the interaction as Owen being out of his depth. That was not what was happening. Then came the moment my father had clearly been waiting for. Marcus's father stood to make a toast. Gerald was the kind of man who gives toasts easily and well, warm, brief, specific. He talked about Marcus as a boy, about watching him grow into someone who leads with kindness, about how lucky the family was that Vanessa had said yes. It was genuinely lovely. People laughed. Vanessa cried a little. Then he raised his glass and asked the table to raise theirs. My father stood almost immediately after, which no one had asked him to. It was just something he did. He talked about Vanessa, her achievements, Osgood, the firm, Marcus's family. He was generous and warm, the way he can be when the spotlight is correctly aimed. And I felt it coming the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. He looked down the table at me. And, of course, our other daughter Jade is here as well. A pause that lasted 1 beat too long. Jade is a nurse, which is a very important job, of course. Another pause. And she's brought her boyfriend, who is a carpenter, I believe. He smiled at the table. We're very supportive of all career paths in our family. Someone laughed. 1 person. But it was enough. I kept my eyes on the tablecloth. I felt Owen's hand find mine under the table and hold it. "Anyway," my father said, and raised his glass toward Vanessa and Marcus. To the happy couple. Everyone drank. I didn't. I just sat there with the words pressing against the back of my teeth, deciding whether to say them or not. Owen squeezed my hand once and let go. Gerald had been watching. I didn't know that yet. The evening moved on. Dessert came out. Tarte citron from a bakery on Laurier Avenue, which was extraordinary. People moved inside. The string lights came on as the sun went down. My mother found me near the bookshelf and told me my dress was very practical. I thanked her as though it were a compliment. Vanessa caught my eye across the room and mouthed, "I'm sorry." I shook my head at her. It was fine. It wasn't, but I was washing my hands in the bathroom off the main hallway when I heard my father in the adjacent room, the study, talking to one of his colleagues. The door was half open. You have to understand, we gave both girls everything. Same schools, same opportunities. Vanessa just ran with it. Jade is, well, she's soft-hearted. Always was. The nursing was her choice, and I respect it. But the boyfriend? He paused. I don't see a future there, honestly. She's 31. At some point, you stop waiting for someone to grow up. I stood in the bathroom for a long time with my hands under the water, which had gone cold. When I came out, Owen was standing near the bottom of the staircase with Gerald and Constance, the architect. I almost walked past them. Then I heard Gerald say something that stopped me completely. Recognized the ironwork on the staircase, and I thought that's too specific to be a coincidence. It's the same hand. He was looking at Owen. You did the Allura Ridge Pavilion. Owen didn't answer immediately. He got this expression I'd seen before, a sort of careful calm, like he was deciding how much to say. I did, yeah. Gerald stared at him. I tried for 2 years to find out who built that structure. My firm commissioned a report on it. We thought it was a European studio. He shook his head slowly. You built the Allura Ridge Pavilion. Constance turned. Wait, the open-air pavilion at Allura Gorge? The one that won the Governor General's Medal for Architecture 2 years ago? The woodwork and structural installation, yes? Owen said quietly. I partnered with an architect out of Waterloo on the design. I should explain what the Allura Ridge Pavilion is for anyone who doesn't know. It's a public structure at Allura Gorge Conservation Area, a large open-air gathering pavilion built from locally sourced white oak with a cantilevered roof and handcrafted joinery that architectural publications apparently spent a considerable amount of time writing about. It won a Governor General's Medal for Architecture, which is about as significant a built environment award as exists in this country. Owen's name was in the project documentation. He had never mentioned it to me directly, and when I'd asked once about awards or recognition, he'd shrugged and said, other people decide what's worth celebrating. I just build things. I knew none of this. I knew he was good at what he did. I didn't know the scale of what he'd made. Gerald turned to look for someone, and his eyes landed on my father, who had come back into the main room and was standing near the fireplace with his drink. Mitchell. My father looked up. Gerald walked toward him with purpose. Your daughter's boyfriend built the Allura Ridge Pavilion. My father blinked. I'm sorry, Owen, the carpenter. Gerald said the word without any of the weight my father had put into it. He built one of the most recognized pieces of public architecture in Ontario in the last decade. His work is in the permanent collection discussion at the Canadian Centre for Architecture. The pavilion is studied in programs at Waterloo at McGill. He paused. Did you know that? My father looked at Owen. Owen was watching him with an expression of complete neutrality. I know, my father said. I didn't know that. You made a joke tonight, Gerald said, quiet but clear, about Jade bringing a carpenter. I want you to understand who you were making a joke about. The room had gone very still. Not silent. There was still music somewhere, still the clink of glasses, but the nearby conversations had stopped. My mother was standing near the kitchen doorway. Vanessa had her hand over her mouth. Marcus was watching his father with an expression of undisguised admiration. My father set down his drink. Owen, I wasn't aware. You don't need to be aware, Owen said, and his voice was mild, completely mild. It wouldn't have changed whether it was right or wrong. That sentence. I've thought about it every day since. My father didn't say anything for a moment. Then he nodded once and walked out toward the garden. My mother followed him. I stood where I was. Gerald turned to me. Your partner is exceptionally talented, he said simply. I'd have led with that if I were you. I didn't know about the medal, I admitted. He smiled. You probably knew everything that mattered. The drive back to the hotel that night was quiet for the first 10 minutes. I sat in the passenger seat watching the Montreal streetlights go by and trying to organize what I felt. There was the anger, the slow, banked kind that had been building for years. There was something like vindication, which I didn't entirely trust. And there was something else, something simpler. Why didn't you tell me, I asked finally, about the pavilion, the award? Owen was quiet for a moment. Because I wanted you to be with me for the right reasons. And you were. I looked out the window for a while. My dad said something tonight, I said. In the study. He said he didn't see a future for us, that he was waiting for me to grow up. Owen didn't respond right away. Then, what do you think? I think I grew up a long time ago, I said. I think he's the one who's still figuring it out. The fallout happened in stages, which I think is how it usually goes in families like mine. It doesn't arrive all at once, it seeps in through the cracks over the following weeks, slow and then faster. Gerald said something to my father the morning after the party. I don't know exactly what Gerald told me later when I asked, that he simply said he'd found my father's remarks unnecessary and that in his experience, the most capable people he'd worked with rarely announced themselves. My father reportedly had little to say in response. My mother called me 2 weeks later. She didn't lead with an apology. That's not how she operates, but she said she'd been thinking, and that she'd perhaps been unfair in how she'd spoken to Owen over the years. She said she was proud of my work as a nurse, that she'd always been proud of it, that she sometimes had difficulty expressing that without comparison. It was the most honest thing I can remember her saying to me in years. I thanked her. I meant it. My father called the week after. His was harder to give and harder to receive. He said he'd spent his whole life equating worth with credentials because it was the only framework he'd been given growing up, and that he hadn't examined it carefully enough, and that he was sorry. He sounded tired, not diminished, just tired, in the way people sound when they've finally sat down with something uncomfortable and looked at it. I said, I know, Dad, because I did. Vanessa and I talked on the phone for almost 2 hours the Sunday after the party. She said she'd spent years feeling guilty for being the one who'd done what our parents wanted, and that she'd been carrying a kind of ambient shame about it that she hadn't known how to name. I told her she had nothing to feel guilty about. She'd worked hard for the life she'd built. None of it was her fault. Owen and I went back to Elora the following month. We parked near the gorge and walked out to the pavilion in the early morning, before the day-use visitors arrived. The light came through the oak joinery at an angle that made the grain glow. He'd been right. There was something in it beyond craft. Something that had required someone to look at a piece of landscape and understand what it needed. Do you want to tell me about it now? I asked. So he did. All of it? The 3 years planning, the sourcing of the timber, the argument with the architect over the cantilever, the site install in February when it was -20, and the joinery kept contracting. The way he'd stood there the morning it was finished and thought, that's the best thing I'd ever made, and then gone home and made lunch. I held his hand and watched the light move through the structure he'd built. My father came to visit us in Guelph in September. He and Owen sat in our kitchen for 2 hours over coffee. My father asked Owen real questions, not interrogations, actual questions, about the work, about the process, about what he was building next. Owen answered him honestly, without performance. At one point, my father laughed, genuinely, at something Owen said about a disagreement with a client over the direction of a staircase curve. When my father left that evening, he shook Owen's hand at the door and said, "You do important work." Owen nodded and said, "So does your daughter, every day." My father looked at me then, really looked at me, in a way he hadn't in years, and said, "I know." I stood in the doorway after he drove away and felt something unknot in my chest that had been there for a very long time. I won't tell you everything is fixed, because it isn't. Families don't work that way, at least not mine. There's still work to do, still old patterns that surface when we're tired or defensive. My mother still occasionally makes comments that require me to take a breath before I respond. But there's also something new, a willingness to try, on all sides. A recognition that the frameworks we'd all been operating inside were too small. Owen and I are still together. He's currently working on a commission for a public library expansion in Hamilton, a reading room installation in white ash, with joinery he's been designing since last winter. I drove out to the workshop last week and watched him work for an hour. He didn't notice me standing in the doorway at first. He was bent over the bench with a marking gauge, completely absorbed. His hands were chalked and careful. I am a nurse. I work with people in the worst moments of their lives, and I do it with everything I have. It is not glamorous work. It is not the kind of work that earns toasts at catered dinner parties. It matters, every day, in ways that don't always get witnessed. Neither of us announced ourselves that night in Montreal. Neither of us needed to. The truth had a way of surfacing on its own. That, I think, is the only thing worth knowing. I still think about what Owen said in that moment, not to Gerald, not to the room, but to my father. It wouldn't have changed whether it was right or wrong. He said it quietly, without bitterness, without any need for the room to hear it land. And it did land. On everyone. That's the thing I keep coming back to. Not the pavilion, not the Governor General's medal that nobody in my family had known about. What stays with me is the fact that Owen had been living with that integrity the entire time, not performing it, not saving it for a moment like that dinner in Westmount. He was just that person, consistently, whether or not anyone was paying attention. That kind of steadiness doesn't come from circumstance. It comes from something built over years, from choosing, over and over, to do the work honestly and let the results speak in their own time. I think about what it cost my father to carry the framework he'd been given, this rigid, unexamined belief that worth could be measured in credentials and titles, and the right kind of firm name on a business card. He didn't build that belief on his own. It was handed to him the way certain things get handed down in families, passed along without anyone asking whether it still fits. The tragedy isn't that he was unkind. The tragedy is that he was incurious. For decades, and incuriosity, I've learned, always catches up with you eventually, not as punishment, but as consequence. The world has a way of placing you in rooms where your assumptions stop protecting you. What got my father into that room, finally, was Gerald, a man who had earned every credential my father respected and who used that standing not to confirm the hierarchy, but to dismantle it. Gerald didn't raise his voice. He didn't humiliate anyone. He just told the truth, plainly, and trusted that it was enough. That's what good judgment looks like in practice. Knowing when to speak, what to say, and why it matters. I've thought about my own part in all of this too. For years, I absorbed my parents' assessments of my choices without pushing back enough. Not because I believed them, but because I didn't want the conflict. There's a version of patience that's actually just avoidance, and I lived in that version for longer than I should have. What changed wasn't Owen's reputation being revealed. What changed was me deciding, somewhere in that bathroom with the cold water running, that I was done carrying the weight of their disappointment as though it were mine to carry. Nursing taught me this actually. You cannot help someone who refuses to examine what's keeping them sick. You can stay present. You can offer what you have, but at some point the other person has to choose to look honestly at themselves. My father finally did that. It took a lot. I'm not going to pretend it didn't, but he did it, and that took something real, a willingness to sit with discomfort and not reach for an excuse. I am proud of the work I do. I am proud of the person Owen is. Neither of those things needed a medal or a guest list or anyone's recognition to be true. They were true before that evening in Westmount, and they'll be true long after. That's the only thing I know for certain. The rest is still unfolding.